There may be some editing to fix this because it didn't tell you everything I should in the right order, but obviously the needle drops down in here, and when it's pushed down, it shuts off the fuel flow of the gasoline coming in. I got the carburetor upside down. This is how we are. And the needle is pushed on by the float, by this little metal tab, and then there's a little bail on there, so when the float drops, if this thing has a tendency to try to stick in the hole because it's got a rubber tip, if the float drops because I've used fuel and I need the needle to open, that little wire helps pull it down in case it tries to stick. One other little trick, I didn't draw this well, I'll update it. You can get in here really close and look. Just about every needle except maybe the cheapest mini bike carburetors, there's a little shock absorber out here on the back of it, so that when you go over bumps and the float tries to jump up and down, it doesn't pound and beat on this sealing area. It absorbs the shock. And if you get a carburetor that's been sitting and it's full of grunge, if that little shock absorber won't move, you've got to put this thing in an ultrasonic cleaner with some solvent and get it free, or you can't use the needle. And that's one thing I didn't draw. Actually, inside the needle, there's a hole down like that. And then there's the little shock absorber post. And then there's a coil spring. And then some kind of swedging to keep this thing from falling out. So, buy that assembly. If it's aftermarket and it's made in Taiwan or something, maybe they're $12 now. I don't know. Go to the dealership and buy a Japanese-made one with the dealership's cut and the warehouse's cut, and you may pay $40-something for that. Well, that's okay if you got one cylinder and one carburetor. You got 4 carburetors, you may be in it for over $100 or $140 just to replace the inlet needles. So, it's worth it if you're a DIY person to polish the inlet, look at the needle and see if the needle's still soft and the little plunger's still moving, and then do some sort of a test to make sure that something's not going past that O-ring, or pop it out and just replace the O-ring. O-rings are cheap. Okay. Oftentimes, this seat is replaceable, and that's where the money is, you know, replacing the needle and seat, and it has an O-ring groove in it. And that O-ring with modern fuel can dry out, and you can actually leak around the needle and seat. You might have a problem where your float is overfilling, or your float bowl is overfilling, and the needle and seat are working properly down here and shutting off the fuel, but this O-ring has shrunk to a point where gasoline's going around it. Anyway, these style needles and seats oftentimes have a little tab up here, and they have a screw, and the screw and the tab holds it in place, and the O-ring seals it, and you can take the tab off and pull this whole assembly out and replace it. But if this still looks nice and you're a do-it-yourselfer, you put a new O-ring on it and rock and roll, and you don't have to replace the brass part. That's brass. Or the needle. We'll give it a different... if you're a draftsman, you'll get the humor in this. The cutaway marks tell you what material it is. And since I didn't use 2 colors because I'm lazy, there you go. Okay, brass, and there's your needle. Now, the other thing that goes on with the needle, well, by the way, this bore needs to be clean, and you don't clean it with anything metal. You polish it with a Q-tip and a little bit of cleaner wax. I've got, you know, some Meguiar's cleaner wax that's got just a tiny bit of grit in it, and you take a Q-tip and stick it down in here and twirl it. And the most, you know, obviously you don't want crud building up on the sides. Pin change. Obviously you don't want foreign matter building up on the sides in here, because this thing is a very close fit to this bore. That can be a problem, but the big problem is when your motorcycle sits for a long time, this needle's down. The gasoline all dries out of the carburetor, the needle drops, and then you start getting corrosion right here. And right here is where the thing seals. So oftentimes, drop the needle out of the way, take a Q-tip. Scott will go get a Q-tip. All right. Stole my wife's supply of Q-tips out of the bathroom. There's one of those. Get me just a little bit of compound here on it. like that. Stuff it down here in this bore and twirl. And now, this is the most critical part of both components. This needle, some of them are hardened steel all the way down, some of them are rubber tipped. The hardened steel ones, if they're starting to show problems, they'll actually have a little groove worn in them, and you can feel it with your thumbnail. That can be polished off if it's mild. The surface right here in the brass, they go to a lot of trouble to make that very round and very true so that the needle seals well on it without the rubber having to deform a lot. But if you got trash down here, here's the setup. Twirl your Q-tip. Look on the end of the Q-tip. That little black circle is where the Q-tip was polishing that corner. So, you know, do-it-yourselfers can get away with this kind of stuff. It's hard to sue yourself when your garage catches on fire. But, and the same thing with this wall, if it's ugly, try to use something soft like this and polish until the hole is clean and the through hole looks good. This carburetor that came off the Harley this morning is a CV carburetor, and they're very common on Japanese motorcycles. They're a little more difficult for some people to understand, but they work really well. If you're talking about sheer horsepower and you're going to go drag bike racing or this or that or the other, a lot of people will tell you, oh, you shouldn't run a CV carburetor, but they can still be made to make a tremendous amount of horsepower. The trick is that the throttle on the front is the one you control. And here I am, there it is, opening this butterfly, saying I want more, I want to go fast. But there's a passageway leading to a diaphragm up here, and we'll pop it open and look at the diaphragm in a minute. And there's a spring, and that inrush of vacuum when you open up the throttle butterfly gets routed up here to the diaphragm, and it pulls the slide up. And that's why this slide, when I let go of it, doesn't just go clunk, because it's actually air going in and out of a little hole. There's a spring pushing the slide down, my finger's pushing it up, but the reason it just doesn't slam down is because this diaphragm is sealed off and the air has to go through a little restriction. So when you got 4 of these, and you got a 4-cylinder motorcycle, and you're wondering if you've got a torn diaphragm or you didn't put the diaphragm back in it right, go boom, 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 and all 4 of them should sound the same. And if you've got one that goes clunk and just drops back down, you got a problem. Or if the carburetor is sat, the motorcycle sat, and this slide is gummed up, and one of them you have to push harder to get it up, all bets are off. This is a very sensitive part of the carburetor. Once again, the impact on the outside of the carburetor, these Phillips screws, you get a good tip and an impact, a little corner impact, and life is grand. Don't let it spin. As soon as it starts spinning, it cuts the screw up. Oh, perfect timing. Oh, we can't get the slide off without getting some of the throttle linkage out of the way on this one. Okay, here we go. Very sensitive little spring. I know people that try to tune these engines by cutting coils off the spring. If you buy a dyno jet kit or somebody else's performance kit, they'll give you a spring sometimes that has a different rate. It's probably a lot better than trimming your own coils. I would say you could get into a lot of trouble there. This little rubber diaphragm is real similar to the O-ring seal on the bottom of the carburetor in the bowl. It's got a lip, and it's engineered so that when that lip is sitting down in the groove, this cap goes on metal to metal. So when I've got this diaphragm in the carburetor properly, I should be able to just push with my finger, and this will go metal to metal. Just the tiniest gap maybe for squeezing the rubber. If I don't get this rubber ring on this slide back where it's supposed to be, and let's try turning the slide the right way. Let's try it again. if this rubber ring, on the outer diameter of the diaphragm is where it's supposed to be, he says. There you go. Okay. Now I got no spring, so it's not going to come down quick. But anyway, you can see that this thing sits nice, and there's just a tiny bit of compression on the rubber because they engineered it with that rubber just a little bit taller than the groove. You start putting one of these together and you see a corner that's up like that, that means you didn't get the diaphragm where you should. Sometimes these diaphragms will scare you to death how much money they are. Sometimes you can't get the diaphragm without buying the entire slide and diaphragm assembly, and sometimes that'll scare you. On a CV carburetor, you can still affect the way the engine runs as it's coming up the tack and as this is pulling by putting a shim under the needle or changing a clip. This one's fixed. It's got a little hat on here that's swedged on. But in some of the kits, where they're taking an emissions engine that's a little bit lean and you're trying to get it just a little bit richer, there'll be some small washers that come with the kit, and you can raise the needle a little bit. This diaphragm is made out of really nice rubber. If it's got a crack in it, if it's been deformed by somebody putting it together wrong, get rid of it. You want this thing to look pretty, and you want to make sure that it doesn't have any tears in it. And like I said, when you got a 4-cylinder carburetor, you just tickle all 4 slides and they should all drop at the same rate. Once again, thank you for watching. Stay tuned for episode 5.